What if I told you there was one inventor, one single person, whose work led to millions of deaths, lowered the IQ of entire generations, and sparked not one but two separate global environmental disasters? I know, it sounds like a comic book supervillain plot, right? But it's a completely true story.
See, this is really a tale of two brilliant scientists. Their paths were on a collision course they couldn't even imagine. One of them, driven by profit, would unleash a poison upon the entire world. And the other, well, he was just trying to figure out how old the Earth was. And in doing so, he'd become the only person who could stop it. Okay, so our story really kicks off in the early 20th century. The automobile is exploding in popularity, and we meet an engineer named Thomas Midgley Jr. Cars were the future, but they had this one really loud and really damaging problem.
So you have these powerful new cars, like the Cadillac Model 30. They're using these high-compression engines to get more power. But here's the issue. The fuel was combusting before the spark plug even fired. This created these awful, chaotic explosions inside the engine. It's called engine knocking. And it wasn't just super loud, it killed the car's power and wrecked the engine over time. So a guy named Charles Kettering at General Motors tasks Midgley with a simple mission: find a chemical additive to make it stop.
Midgley spent 5 years testing literally everything he could think of, from melted butter to iodine. And then he found it. His miracle solution, tetraethyl lead. And on paper, wow, it was perfect. It was incredibly cheap to produce, and you only needed a tiny amount, like 1 part per thousand, to turn any low-grade fuel into smooth, high-octane gasoline. It was a golden ticket.
And this quote, well, it tells you everything you need to know about the motivation here. Midgley knew he had just struck oil, so to speak. That $200 million? That's over $3 billion in today's money. The focus wasn't on safety. It was squarely on the massive profits to be made.
Now, the dangers of lead poisoning were already well known back then. So Midgley and the newly formed Ethyl Corporation launched this huge campaign of deception. First, they named the product ethyl to completely avoid using the word lead. Then, as factory workers started getting terribly sick and some even died, Midgley held this wild press conference. He poured the chemical all over his hands and then inhaled its fumes for a full minute, all to prove it was safe. The truly insane part? He himself was secretly recovering from severe lead poisoning at the time.
Okay, now we need to shift gears completely. While all this is happening, while Midgley is selling the world on his leaded gasoline, a different scientist is starting a journey that has nothing to do with cars and everything to do with the very beginning of our planet.
This is Clair Patterson. He's a chemist who had worked on the Manhattan Project, which meant he was an absolute expert at using these amazing machines called mass spectrometers to separate elements. After the war, he decided to use this incredible skill to answer one of the biggest questions in all of science. Just how old is the Earth?
His method was just brilliant. See, certain radioactive elements, like uranium, decay into other elements, in this case, lead, at a perfectly constant known rate. It's like a geological clock that's been ticking since the dawn of time. So the plan was to measure the ratio of uranium to lead in some really ancient crystals. Do a little math, and boom, you know how long that clock has been running.
But he immediately hit a wall, a huge, frustrating wall. Every measurement he took was completely haywire. His samples showed hundreds of times more lead than should have been there. It didn't matter how careful he was. Every single thing he tested was contaminated. This wasn't just a small error, it was a massive, mysterious problem that was making his entire life's work totally impossible.
Patterson became absolutely obsessed. He started to suspect the lead wasn't coming from his ancient rocks, but from the modern world all around him. And to solve this problem, he was going to have to do something so extreme, he'd end up inventing something that would change science forever.
He moved to Caltech and built an entirely new lab from the ground up. I mean, he scrubbed everything, he filtered all the air coming in, he even had the lead solder ripped out of the pipes and wiring in the walls. You had to wear a full plastic suit just to get inside. He had, without really meaning to, invented the modern clean room, a concept that is now absolutely vital for making everything from computer chips to spaceships. And it worked. Inside this ultra-pure lab, totally sealed off from the outside world's contamination, Patterson analyzed meteorites that had formed at the same time as our planet. And he finally got his answer. The Earth was 4.55 billion years old. He had done it. He had solved one of the greatest riddles in science.
But Patterson couldn't let it go. Sure, he'd found the age of the Earth, but he still had this nagging question. Why was his old lab, and by extension the entire world, so incredibly contaminated with lead? Answering that question would take him from geology right into the middle of a decades-long public health crusade against a hugely powerful global industry.
First, he looked at the oceans. The logic was simple. If the lead was just naturally occurring, you'd expect to find about the same amount of it everywhere, right? Top to bottom. But as you can see here, he found that the surface waters had almost 10 times more lead than the deep ocean. It was a brilliant way to prove the pollution was recent, and it was definitely man-made.
But his next piece of evidence was the real smoking gun. It came from ice cores drilled in Greenland. This is basically a timeline of our atmosphere, frozen in ice. You can see these little bumps in lead levels during the Roman Empire and the Industrial Revolution. But then, look what happens right after leaded gasoline is introduced. The level just skyrockets into this terrifying vertical spike. There was no denying what was causing it.
And maybe the most shocking discovery of all came when he compared human bones. He got a hold of ancient Egyptian mummies and compared them to modern humans. And he found that people in the 20th century had up to 1,000 times more lead in their bodies. That idea that a little bit of lead was natural, it was a total lie. This was a massive, industrial-scale poisoning of the entire human race.
And the cost to humanity was just staggering. Lead is a powerful neurotoxin, and it's especially damaging to children's developing brains. One study estimated that in the U.S. alone, leaded gas caused a collective loss of over 800 million IQ points. It's been linked to permanent learning disabilities, behavioral problems, and even a huge spike in violent crime rates from the 70s to the 90s. And more recently, a 2018 study found it was likely responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths from heart disease every single year.
Now, as you can imagine, the lead industry fought Patterson for decades. They tried to ruin his reputation, they got his research funding cut, but his data was just too solid. It was irrefutable, and eventually the world had no choice but to listen.
And here's something that's just unbelievable. Leaded gasoline wasn't even Midgley's only global catastrophe. He also invented Freon, which he might know as CFCs. It was supposed to be a super safe refrigerant. He even did another one of his publicity stunts where he inhaled a lungful of it and blew out a candle. Turns out, those same CFCs floated up into the stratosphere and ripped a giant hole in our ozone layer, all while being a powerful greenhouse gas. One historian said Midgley had more impact on the atmosphere than any other single organism in Earth's history. Just think about that.
But thanks to Clair Patterson's relentless, decades-long fight, the truth finally won. Leaded gasoline was slowly phased out, country by country, until the very last nation banned it in 2021. The UN estimates that the global ban saves over 1 million lives and nearly $2.5 trillion every single year. And what happened to Thomas Midgley? Well, in 1940, he contracted polio, which left him severely disabled. Being an inventor, he created this complex system of ropes and pulleys to help lift himself out of bed. And then, in a final tragic bit of irony, in 1944, he got tangled in his own invention and was strangled to death. Benjamin Franklin wrote this all the way back in 1786, specifically warning about the dangers of lead. It took almost 200 more years, and the obsessive work of a scientist who just wanted to know how old the world was, for that useful truth to finally be acted upon.
This whole story is just such a powerful reminder of how science can uncover these really inconvenient truths, and how incredibly difficult it can be to get society to actually do something about them. It really leaves you with a critical question to think about. What useful and maybe inconvenient truths are we choosing to ignore right now?